man, I'm trying to do the best that I can with what it is I have. I ain't no perfect man, I'm trying to do the best that I can with what it is I have. Put my heart and soul into the song. Yes, yes. I hope you feel me.
Hello and welcome back, Uniondale High School. This is our second installment of our virtual professional development. And I'm really excited about this series and some of the things we're going to be talking about. You guys already have access to Google Classroom and you see the syllabus. And I wanted to start teaching our lessons so you can use them at your leisure. Remember, this is voluntary. This is something that we are trying to be innovative and do. So check it out if you feel so inclined. If you do not, it's totally okay. So the title of this presentation is called Laying Down the Foundation, Understanding Adolescent Development. And before we talk about instruction and classroom management and planning, we have to understand where our teens are. And it's important that we understand where they are developmentally. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, the research question that I pose is how can educators effectively meet the unique needs and challenges of high school students? And this is a question that if I had the answer to, I'd be rich. But it's a very difficult question because teenagers are changing in so many different ways. And we're all figuring out how to work with teenagers as they change. Society is changing, technology is changing, their living environments are changing. And so the challenge continues and morphs into something that we have to figure out together. Now, what are some of the things that we would title as abnormal behaviors by teenagers? We were teenagers once, so we have to be sensitive about that. But there's some behaviors that we're noticing with our teenagers that we work with that we want to think about. One is mood swings. Our teenagers are going through lots of changes. Their bodies are changing. The way that they see themselves is changing. They're becoming more and more, let's say, a little bit unstable emotionally because of some of those changes. And that's a challenge for all of us as educators and as teenagers. There's a loss of control. A lot of our teenagers lose control in terms of their emotions, their speech, their behavior. It also varies based on different cultural home structure, standards, the birth order in which they're raised. There's so many different factors that contribute to a teenager's ability or inability to control themselves. Next is that term aggression. And I always want to be careful about the term aggression because we know that race, class, and gender also impacts the way that we define a person as being aggressive. Sometimes they're just being assertive or they have a specific way of speaking. And so we want to think about how do we help teenagers that may struggle in those areas, which is a normal part of teen development. So the problem statement that I came up with is twofold. One is about students, and also the second is about teachers. When it comes to students, the first thing that I think about is academic stress and a pressure to achieve high grades. You know, a lot of our students want to do well academically, and sometimes the behaviors that they display might not be indicative of that desire, but most of our students want to do well academically, and that causes a lot of stress, which leads to certain behaviors. Next, there's social pressure. The desire to fit in, to be a part of a tribe or a group, to find your identity is very difficult for a lot of our students. What also impacts the social pressures is social media and standards around beauty through social media and how narcissism sometimes develop because of overindulging in social media. And then there's body image issues that some of our students have challenges with. Relationships, friendships, dating, finding someone that you're attracted to, all of these different relationship issues start to impact the way that our students are able to engage in the classroom. The other problem statement is with teachers, right? So, as teachers, a big challenge that a lot of us have is student engagement and keeping the students motivated. We are dealing with a generation that is addicted to TikTok and Instagram and all these different social media platforms. And as teachers, we have to contend with that in the classroom and figure out how to keep students engaged. That's a big problem for a lot of us, even for me as a parent and also as a person who's an educator. I've seen that it's been more and more difficult to maintain student engagement in the classroom. Time management. Johnson in 2022 looked at the challenges that educators have in terms of managing their work life and making sure that students are being held responsible for what they're supposed to do in the classroom. And then there's student behavior and having to deal with disruptive students on a daily basis. This can lead to teacher burnout. We've noticed that there's been a huge turnover in terms of teacher attrition, and we want to figure out how can we address that problem as a school. Some of the key terms that you want to think about and we want to think about as we work with teenagers that are common with teenagers. One is a lack of frustration tolerance. Our students have difficulty in coping and dealing with frustration, and it leads to outbursts, it leads to fights and conflicts with teachers. So our students have a huge challenge there in terms of dealing with frustration, which we all have to deal with. Next is low impulse control. Our students are not in a space where they have experienced delayed gratification. They get instant dopamine rushes every time that they click or swipe on their phones. So they have trouble resisting urges and impulses. They feel as if they are unable to restrain themselves when they're dealing with conflict or emotions or anything else. So impulse control has been a challenge, an increasing challenge, especially in our high schools. Next, withdrawal from family. A lot of our students are becoming a little bit more withdrawn, wanting to isolate themselves from family members, in some ways trying to seek their own identity, which is understandable. And we have to figure out how to get them to engage with family members and to not isolate themselves. A lot of our students are beginning to sleep a little bit longer. They're a little bit more fatigued. Personally, I believe that the COVID-19 era had a lot to do with some of those sleeping patterns. If you notice, students are staying up a little bit later and their cell phone usage. All of these different things are also leading to fatigue and depression and causing other underlying issues that they have to face. Next, teacher fatigue. Teachers are hardworking individuals. It's the most noble profession there is. But a lot of our teachers are very tired because they have to deal with a lot of these issues on a daily basis in the classroom. And it can be very, very tiring. So, some of the theoretical frameworks that I think about as we think about working with our teenagers is one, the ecological systems theory, something that you're going to hear a lot about from me specifically. And one of the key points of the theory is it examines how individuals are influenced by their environment, such as their family, their school, and their community. So, as we look at teenagers, we want to think about these different layers, these different environments, and how it impacts how they perform in school. Sometimes, as educators, we can take their behaviors personally and think that their behaviors are a personal attack on us. But when we start to peel back the layers, we realize that they are raised in certain families, they live in certain communities, and they have certain beliefs that might negatively impact the way that they go about interacting with folks. So that's something that we want to keep in mind. Next is social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory states that it emphasizes the role of social learning and observation in shaping behavior and attitudes. A lot of who our students are is based on their surroundings. Specifically, the reason that I use an Instagram logo is because a lot of what they're learning about what it means to be is through social media. And we know that social media might not have the best images or memes or ways of thinking posted throughout that platform. And that's what's raising a lot of our children. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is something that I can relate to as a theoretical framework, and that's generational bias. Sorry for putting that image up. Um, but what it states is that people from different generations may have unique perspectives, values, and behaviors that can influence their lives. So for myself, because I grew up in a certain era and I grew up in a certain way, I usually have trouble sometimes understanding the behaviors of teenagers. And probably you can relate. When I see teenagers say and do certain things, I immediately say I could have never done that because of how I was raised and the rules and regulations of that time. And I'm learning that my bias can hinder their growth. My bias can hinder their ability to open up and talk about some of the challenges that they face. Then I have to be humble about my generation as well. And we have to be humble about our generation because we come from a very interesting generation, depending on when you were born. These are some of the biases and some of the hypocrisy I have to admit about myself when I think about generational bias. For some of us, this was the best movie on earth. We had crushes on these individuals and their fashion sense and everything that was cool about the Breakfast Club. We wanted to be a part of it. So these are examples of some of the generational disconnects that we have. The fashion that we had back in these times were very interesting, and we believed that the way that we dressed was just the best way. And here you have an image of some of the fashion. Probably not you. Probably I'm misjudging you. But these are some of the things that our generations thought was cool. Um, you know, the highlights, the belts. It was a very different time. And so when we think about the teenagers that we work with, don't forget that at some point you were a teenager and you wore very interesting clothing as well. And you have some bias. And this is my personal, I'm being vulnerable here. This is my generation. And this is what I thought was the coolest thing on earth. Uh, Wu-Tang Clan. They still are, just so we're clear. Um, but these are our biases. And when we bring our bias into classrooms and we bring our bias into conversations with teenagers, we have to be humble because we all came from a certain space and we had certain beliefs that I don't know if it was right or wrong, but we had some very interesting ways of being. Let's say that. So I wanted to show this infographic just about the teenage brain because I think it'll help us understand some of the challenges that our teenagers might be facing. The first thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the development of the teenage brain is the prefrontal cortex. Here it says teenagers may struggle with decision making, planning, and impulse control due to the developing of the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is what's in charge of all of the decisions that we make, and it doesn't finish its development until the mid 20s, until we're mid 20s, 25 years old. So a lot of the decisions that our teenagers are making aren't the best. And if you think about the decisions you made as a teenager, you can attest to that. Some of the fashion statements, tattoos, the people that we liked, it wasn't necessarily done in a way that we look back and say this was a wise decision. It we humbly accept that we have a past. Let's just say that. Then there's the limbic system, which regulates emotions, memory, mood swings, risk taking. And this system, it takes time to develop again. Its completion happens in the mid 20s. And this is when we go to our extremes emotionally, our mood swings. Right now, what we see with our teenagers is them wanting to fight someone over an Instagram post or something that they thought they heard from someone else. And it just fluctuates from day to day. and that's a part of the development of the teenage brain. Then it's synaptic pruning, which is a really cool term that I kind of learned through this presentation. And it says, while refining cognitive abilities, synaptic pruning can also make teenagers vulnerable to negative influences. And what happens is the brain goes through a process where you start to cut off certain parts of your being and identity and ways of thinking that you kind of learned as you grew up. Some teenagers have more trouble doing this than others. They're unable to disconnect from their adolescence and their youth and the way that they thought about things. And again, it depends on so many different factors: their race, class, gender, their culture, their geographical setting, what's normal, their social norms in the settings that they're in. So synaptic pruning is something that's a challenge for our students. And then the final one, which is the, I'm sorry, I'm blocking myself here, is plasticity. And plasticity is the teenager's brain's ability to adapt and present new opportunities for learning and growth. So this talks about the teenager's ability to learn and grow and absorb information, which is something that we want to think about and be optimistic about because they still have the ability to grow if we give them the opportunity to do so. Plasticity. Something else that I wanted to mention as we close is behaviors based on gender. And when you look at some of the statistics around some of the challenges, let me go back, that our teenagers face, it does vary based on agenda. When you look at moodiness, irritability, defiance or rebellion, alcohol consumption, some of the biggest disparities, I would say, is defiance or rebellion between girls and boys, or perceived defiance and rebellion between boys and girls. Um, it shows that there's a higher percentage for boys. And we want to think about what that means for some of the young men that we deal with on a regular basis and why that's happening. Identity formation is huge, and their definition of what it means to be masculine or feminine is it changes over time. So we want to think about that as we interact with our boys. What we see also is that there's a huge disparity in drug abuse and consumption that we want to think about. And some of the thoughts that came to mind was, how can teachers help teenagers during this transition? What's the best way to support our teenagers? Well, the first thing is keeping your promises. As teachers, it's not healthy to make empty threats that you cannot fulfill. And we want to be very careful about what we say we're going to do. And the best way to deal with with students specifically in terms of keeping promises is engaging parents. Parents are our partners. They can help us in so many different ways. So you want to engage parents as much as you can. Make sure and give teenagers privacy. You want to praise them publicly and correct them privately. Sometimes in the classroom, if we are subconsciously trying to embarrass a teenager, it doesn't go too well. It doesn't really work. So you want to make sure and praise publicly and correct privately. You want to set healthy boundaries. I know as teachers, we want to be culturally relevant and we want to be relatable and kind and all these different kinds of things. But someone taught me something a long time ago. As an educator, it's okay to be friendly, but you cannot be friends with students. And we can talk about that more in person, but we want to be very careful about the the fine line between being friendly and developing unhealthy relationships with students that can now confuse them in terms of their role in school as scholars. Next, active listening. Listen to what they say, but more importantly, listen to what they do. Listen to their body language. Teenagers usually let you know very early on how they're feeling and what they're thinking if you pay enough attention to their body language. Talk with them, do not talk at them. Sometimes, as teachers and as educators, we have a way of speaking to students, and we don't think that they can detect our sarcasm. We don't think that they can detect that we're belittling them, but they can't. So it's not wise to do that because it triggers a lot of our teenagers and it turns into tension in the classroom. Be present. It's always interesting to me to see the students who misbehave, and then when they pursue a sport or they're into something that they're really passionate about, how the people who were the loudest about the thing that they did wrong become very quiet about the things that they're doing that's right. And so we want to be present and we want to support the things that they are passionate about and things that they give attention to. Finally, praise them as much as you possibly can. Positive reinforcement always works with our students. Second to last slide are a few pointers in terms of things that teachers might want to avoid when dealing with teenagers. One, stereotypes. You do not know them. You do not know what they're capable of. You do not know who they will be in a few years. And you can't judge them based on this moment in time. So be careful about stereotyping students, comparing students. They are individuals. Sometimes we use comparison in a toxic way, probably to stir up competition or competitiveness, but we need to be very careful about how we do that. Next, sarcasm. I've seen this cause so many problems in classrooms. And what I always tell teachers is do not give what you cannot take. And being sarcastic with students shuts them down, it makes them disengage. And sometimes you might say or do something that you can't come back from. Ignoring students. When you ignore students, you give them power. I'll say that again. When you ignore a student, you empower them to continue whatever negative behaviors they're engaging in. You have to engage students. You have to take a deep breath. You have to engage parents and be very wise about just ignoring students because it's not the best for you or for the student. You have to be careful with abusive punishment. The consequence for the student's behavior should be appropriate. Sometimes we want a student who didn't copy their homework to be sent out of the building for a year straight. Those extremes aren't the wisest in terms of engaging students. Check your, and the next one is checking your biases. We all have bias. It's implicit, meaning that we can't see it and we don't know what it is. And for those of us who don't believe we have one, that's not humanly possible. We all have a bias, and we have to be humble about those biases and be careful about the students that we might have a personal issue towards. And being passive aggressive. Some of us, I've done it. I've done very passive aggressive things towards students that I have problems with, and had to go back in humility and be the adult in the room and be self-reflective. So these are some of the things that teachers should really avoid in terms of engaging students. And also in terms of teacher practice, something you want to avoid as much as you possibly can is excessive lecturing. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get into our pedagogical practices. And sometimes when people talk about lecturing, they only talk about the negative impact it has on students. These are some of the negative impacts of lecturing on teachers and how it harms teachers. One, low student engagement. Students tune out, they don't pay attention. It increases a teacher's stress level, which is really shocking because you believe that a person who's lecturing the entire time is less stressed and they're in control, but that's not true. It actually increases your stress. It lowers your job satisfaction. The thought of coming into a school and thinking about lecturing for 5 or 6 periods a day is really frustrating and it's unhelpful to you. It's harmful to you. It's impossible to assess student learning because you're lecturing. You can't really figure out if students know what they know because you're lecturing so much. And abusive punishment, we talked about that again. So Take these notes in mind. I'd love to hear your feedback in terms of what resonated with you, what made sense, what didn't make sense, or what you had more questions about. I'll post this to our classroom so you guys can look at it and listen to it when you have some time. Thanks again and have an amazing day. Take care.